So yes, my subject is the dominance of secular humanism. As I said last night, these titles have been given to me. I've been assigned these titles, but there are other good ones, and let's see what I can make of tonight's title. But I'm not going to go directly to the dominance of secular humanism. I'm going to go back into history and work at it crabwise. So, many of you know, well, as Jnanadhara mentioned, I work in India. I spend 4 or 5 months every year in India working amongst people in our movement there, who mainly come from the Dalit community, and I'll say more about that. But for them, this period is a very important one. And in many ways, it ought to be more important for us, but we don't know so much about it. So you probably know that, or maybe you don't, but Indians around this time are celebrating a number of quite important festivals. On the 5th of October, they celebrated Dasara, which is the celebration of the victory of the god Rama over the demon Ravana. You don't need to know about this. But it's an integral part of what we now call Hinduism. But Buddhists see it quite differently. They have a different interpretation of Dasara. They say, and there's some historical basis for this, that this was the day, the occasion on which the great Emperor Ashoka forswore war. The story is, Ashoka, by the way, you may not know, but he lived in the 3rd or 2nd century before the Common Era. Scholars are still debating when exactly he lived. It's not that clear. In fact, he'd almost been completely lost from history until European scholars rediscovered him. But he is a very, very important figure in Indian history and has worldwide significance, which I hope I'll be able to communicate to you in a few words. So Ashoka was part of the Mauryan dynasty, which was gradually expanding in North India from its capital in Patna, which is in modern-day Bihar. And it was expanding in the usual way that empires expand, by warfare. And warfare that was especially bloody. So Ashoka inherited from his father and continued the expansion of the empire. And he was expanding it down into the area now known as Odisha, which is just, it doesn't matter where it is. And he fought a battle against a confederacy called the Kalingas. And he won the battle, but at enormous cost. The accounts I've read say 150,000 died on one side, and on his side 100,000 died. And so after the battle, he was surveying the field and just seeing it littered with corpses. And a sudden sort of revulsion took place in him. My goodness, there are some people we wish would have that revulsion now. A sudden revulsion took place in him as he realized that his aspirations to expand the empire were causing such huge suffering. Not only the death of soldiers, but the tragedy for the soldiers' wives and children, the destruction of families, the destruction of villages, and so forth. And he made a tremendous vow. He vowed that from now on, he would not try to conquer by warfare. He would conquer through the Dharma. And from then on, he did not try to take over other territories. He ruled with a remarkable justice, really exemplary justice. He had, on that field of battle, converted to Buddhism because he saw that as the answer, as it were, to the suffering that he had caused. His mother apparently was a Buddhist. So he converted to Buddhism. There weren't very many Buddhists at that time. Even 300 years after the Buddha's life, Buddhism had not become a national religion. It hadn't spread much in India. But Ashoka had been influenced by Buddhism, and it's that, probably, we don't really know, but probably that led him to this tremendous revulsion. So he decided that from then on he would rule with justice. And we know what he aspired to do, because he set up all over India rock edicts. He had carved into rock edicts which promulgated the moral principles on which he intended to rule. And they're extraordinary. They're remarkably far-reaching and even modern, you might say. For instance, he set up hospitals. He even set up hospitals for animals. And he pronounced his care for every citizen. And he had special emissaries whose job was to make sure that the governors governed justly. So it's all set out. You can buy books which give you all the rock edicts. Interestingly, because the kingdom, the empire as it spread up into northwest India, up into what is now Pakistan and Afghanistan, he was ruling Greeks, because those were still Greek kingdoms left over from Alexander's conquest, because he was 2 generations before. So there are some of the rock edicts in Greek, which is rather remarkable for us who are Europeans. And if you're a European, you're half a Greek, if you see what I mean, because it's so much the basis of our culture. But yes, in these rock edicts, he set out a true, just rule. And other lands would gradually accede to his empire because they saw it was just. They saw that it was ruled well, that they would be protected. So this is a tremendous example for the world, and for us as Buddhists, an inspiration for, in a sense, what we should be trying to do. But more of that later on, after we've come to secular humanism. But I want to say a little bit about this Dharma that he decided he would conquer with from that point on. And of course, the conquest was not a violent one. It was a conquest of example. So people acceded to the empire because they saw it was governed justly, in accordance with the highest moral principles, and that they would prosper, they would benefit if they were under Emperor Ashoka's protection. It's a very, very important figure for Buddhists, and any Buddhist in India, any Buddhist occasion, you'll see a picture of the Emperor Ashoka there amongst the headliners, as it were. And they see that what they're trying to do is restore Emperor Ashoka's empire, the empire of the Dharma. So let's just pause and think a little bit about what this Dharma is that Ashoka wanted to rule by and wanted to conquer by. Conquer here, of course, is metaphorical. Well, the Dharma is what the Buddha realized when he awoke, when he gained enlightenment. When he gained enlightenment, he saw the Dharma. He saw the ultimate truth of things. He saw the way things really are. He saw through the illusion that we usually live under, that this is it. This ordinary world is everything. He saw through that and saw the ultimate nature of everything. At this point, words should fail me, because if I start to speak, I'm falsifying automatically. But I want to make a few points about this Dharma that might clarify it a little. It's spoken of as the Dharma, but you shouldn't therefore think that it's a sort of neutral, impersonal principle, a sort of almost like an ultimate postulate, an ultimate philosophy or something like that. It should be seen as dynamic, as vital, even in a certain sense as alive, a living principle that is at the heart of everything, that when we follow the Buddhist path, we gradually find ourselves realizing more and more deeply until we gain full and perfect enlightenment, samyak sambodhi, when, in a sense, we become the Dharma. And everything we do from that point on is simply the expression of the Dharma. So that's the most important meaning of the Dharma. It's the ultimate truth of things, which is to be realized directly through illumination, insight, spiritual understanding, by the gradual transformation of oneself so that one lets go of one's attachment to a separate I. Well, if you want to know more, keep coming and keep going to the classes and so forth, and you'll hear more and more and more about the Dharma. But at least let me say this, it's this ultimate principle which is not merely static and as it were abstract, intellectual. It's something much richer, much fuller, much deeper. It's dynamic. It works in the world. It works through the world. At the same time, it's not God. Not God in the sense that we're usually accustomed to thinking of God in the European and Middle Eastern religions. It's something unnameable, beyond real intelligibility. The Buddha says it's atarka vacharo, beyond the reach of reason, beyond the reach of logic. You can't logic your way to it. In fact, you can only get to it by turning logic on its head. So that's probably sufficiently confusing, but it's that principle that Ashoka felt able to serve. He had sufficient experience of it, grasp of it, and he had teachers who could communicate it to him, and he was able to guide his actions as ruler by the Dharma. And we're going to come back to this because it's a very, very important principle in Buddhism. And Ashoka is really the ideal Buddhist ruler. If you want to know more about him, there's a very good biography of Ashoka by Charles Allen. He's a very good writer, called Ashoka. We don't know very much about him, but what we do know, Charles Allen sets out very clearly. So, yes, Ashoka served the Dhamma and operated through the Dhamma. There's another meaning of Dharma, which is probably the one that we're more familiar with, which is not the content of the Buddha's experience, but the expression of that experience. So having realized the Dharma, the Buddha taught, and his teaching was the Dharma in that sense. So he tried to communicate the essence of what he'd experienced and the way that we could experience it, and that is the Dharma. So it's the Dharma as reality itself and the Dharma as path and teaching. And of course, Ashoka promoted the Dharma as teaching very vigorously, although, interestingly enough, he vows in his rock edicts to uphold all good teaching. He was not sectarian, and he did not enforce Buddhism. Again, another wonderful example of what true Buddhism is. Buddhism should not force people to be Buddhists. If you're forced to be a Buddhist, you're not a Buddhist. You can only be a Buddhist if you're free not to be a Buddhist, our teacher says. So that's the Dharma. The Dharma is both what the Buddha experienced, which we can experience if we follow the Dharma as teaching, as path. So the 5th of October this year was Ashoka Vijaya Dashami in Buddhist language. In general Indian language, in Hindu language, it's Vijaya Dashami, the date when, the mythic god Rama conquered the demon Ravana. But Buddhists, as it were, turn that round and say it's to do with a massive moral revolution that took place. So it's a lunar festival. It's therefore a movable feast, and it takes place at a different time every year. But in 1956, Dasara, Ashoka Vijaya Dashami, fell on the 14th of October, so in 2 days' time. And on that day, another massive event in the history of Buddhism, which had vast reverberations, which are still working themselves out in India, and even more widely. Right now in London, there's a conference going on this event. The great Indian leader, who was born an untouchable, but managed through benevolent patronage from nobility in India, Rajas, gained a very good education. He was educated at Columbia University in New York, gained a doctorate there, again at LSE, gained another doctorate, became a barrister at law, and returned to India he's born in 1895, and returned to India, a highly qualified man, to find that however qualified he was, and probably a great deal more qualified than pretty well everybody else, he was still an untouchable. And that he did not have the opportunities that he sort of expected that he could have in a modern society. So he was, as it were, awakened. His consciousness was raised. He realized that there needed to be a great struggle against the caste system, and especially the place that gave to the bottom 20%, who are, as it were, outside the ordinary caste system, are considered, untouchable, in some cases even unseeable. It's a horrible story. I'm not going to labour it too much. It still goes on in India, in parts of India. It's still very strong in the villages. It's lessened in its formal intensity, but it's still a factor. When people know you are what we now call a Dalit, that is what would have been previously called an untouchable, when people know that, they may not accept you for a job. They may not offer you a place. It's only because the Indian constitution guarantees special places in administration, education for Dalits that many have done as well as they have. So it still goes on. It's much weaker, and perhaps it's weakening. Arguably it's weakening, but there are many signs that it's still pretty strong. And so Dr. Ambedkar struggled, and he was a very, very strong man with enormous energy and tremendous sort of presence and prestige. Our own teacher met him on 3 famous occasions. He's written about it in a book called Ambedkar and Buddhism. So Dr. Ambedkar, Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar. Everybody ought to know about him. Certainly all Buddhists ought to know about him. He's a very, very significant figure, and probably the one of the most important Buddhists of the 20th century. So he struggled to bring about reform in many ways. He was taken by the British into the Viceroy's administrative council during the Second World War, where he formulated the basis for India's labour law. He was a Labour member. After the war, India, of course, gained independence, and at Lord Mountbatten's suggestion, he was made law minister. And again, at Mountbatten's suggestion, he was put onto the Constitutional Commission that was formulating the Constitution of India. And that constitution has kept India a democracy consistently since 1950, and very effective in many ways. So he was the chair of the Constitutional Commission. He's venerated in India as such, mostly, not altogether. And he created a modern constitution for India. But he quickly realized that a constitution was not enough, because the essence of the culture that dominated India was a caste-based culture. And that caste-based culture was one thing, the constitution was another. The constitution was an ideal, liberal, democratic constitution. But the social system of India, and it still is to a large extent, was based on caste. That is, on what Dr. Ambedkar called graded inequality. So he realized that constitutions are not enough. Political change is not enough. It's important because of the constitution. Many of my friends have gained a decent education. Some have even got quite high-ranking posts in administration because there are reserved places for them, what we would call affirmative action, which has been very, very effective in changing the situation for Dalits. So he became strongly disenchanted, realised he'd done what he could in the political sphere. There was nothing more he could do there, and that what he had to do was confront the issue itself that lay behind it. He famously said that democracy is not a way of voting. It's a state of mind. It's an attitude of one citizen to another, an attitude of respect and even maitri, love, metta, of one citizen for another. So he realised that you can't change the way in which society works. You can't bring about a social democracy without changing the fundamental mindset of people. And first of all, he needed to change the mindset of his own people. People like him who were identified still as untouchable, who needed to experience themselves simply as human beings. So he concluded that what he had to do was find a new religion. He had to get out of the religion that held the caste system and find one that established genuine freedom, genuine humanity, and genuine positive relations between citizens. So on the 14th of October 1956, he converted to Buddhism with somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000. Nobody counted exactly, but a huge, huge gathering converted to Buddhism. Many of them illiterate, desperately poor, and I know people who were there, and they said that they went from the conversion straight home and just chucked the Hindu gods away and just set up the Buddha and lived a new life. They said, I remember one Dhammacharini, a member of our order, saying it was as if the whole family was reborn. They're just completely different. They acted differently. He emphasized morality, good behavior, and dignity. And he says, ours is a battle for the human personality. Ours is a battle for dignity. So, Dr. Ambedkar, in discussing the conversion, he never considered, he says, just ditching religion. And this is quite important. He decided it was not possible just to get rid of religion. And he was already a little bit critical of the direction that things were going in the West, even though it was nowhere near where we are now. But he was concerned that, the way he put it was that human beings are naturally religious. We naturally have a sense of something beyond us, a sense of something higher. And that if human beings are to be at all happy and fulfilled, they need to look to some ideal, to something beyond themselves. But it must be, as it were, a human ideal. It can't be something, the orders of some higher force or whatever. It must be the human being who reaches up to something beyond themselves. So he considered that to deprive people of religion was to diminish them. And so he felt it was extremely important that in taking them out of a religion that condemned them to a an inferior position, he found for them a religion that accepted their dignity and encouraged them to act morally and to become more than themselves. But he also thought religion, and I use religion in a very loose sense because there's always that question, is Buddhism a religion? Certainly isn't in the way in which we generally think of it in Europe and the post-European societies. We generally think of it in terms of a god. It's actually not the basic way in which people in the East have tended to think religiously. Even in India there were gods, but there was never a sort of creator god in the literal sense that we tend to think of it here. So yes, he considered that religion was absolutely necessary as a foundation for society, because if you want to have a morality must be based in a vision of the world, the vision of reality. Do you see what I mean? If morality is just a code that's promulgated, it has no real foundation. It has to be deeply emerge from the nature of reality. It needs to follow from the way things are. If, to use the Buddhist terminology, if you see Dharma, then you act morally, naturally. It follows from it. So that society has to have some moral underpinning. He said you cannot control the majority by law. You can only control the lawless minority by law. The majority are controlled, if that's the right word, are guided by moral principle. And that moral principle must be steeped in the essential nature of things. This is very, very crucial for my argument, so I hope you've got me clear so far when we come to have a look at that dreadful, secular humanism and its dominance. This is where we're going to get to it, if you see what I mean. That morality depends upon the way you understand what the universe is, what it's for, where it's going, what our place in it is. Morality, if you like, to put it philosophically, follows from metaphysics. And you can see that the struggles that the rationalists had from the earliest period, the European Enlightenment, the struggles they had to find a rational basis for morality has never entirely convinced me in my struggles with Western philosophy. You know, sometimes they're very keen arguments, and sometimes you can see they're getting at something deeper. But you cannot merely by reason found morality. You can try it with a categorical imperative and that sort of thing, but you sort of in the end think, well, why? Why not just get what I want? Why not, while this short life lasts, just have a good life? So Dr. Ambedkar believed that to get rid of the evil of that system of graded inequality, and we have our own systems of graded inequality, which are not as, of course, entrenched and as religiously validated, but we've got class systems still in Britain. We've got, of course, racism of various kinds, and so on. So we've got our own graded inequality. But Dr. Ambedkar said if you want to attack a fundamentally unjust society and replace it with a decent one, you have to have some perspective on human life that goes beyond mere birth and death. You have to understand what it is to be a human being, what, in that sense, our purpose is as human beings. And once you've understood that, from that follows morality. And that morality is, as it were, guaranteed or exemplified by those who have realized the Dhamma. Those who've realized the Dhamma truly become incapable of evil action. It's just not possible for them because the basis for it in selfishness has gone. So Dr. Ambedkar he was thinking and working at a time when secular humanism was definitely an option, if you see what I mean. It was becoming the dominant force in what we call the West, and spreading beyond the West, of course. So it was definitely an option for him to think, okay, we'll just ditch religion and we'll have a socialist society or whatever, some sort of political philosophy, which, of course, the founders of the post-independence founders, Nehru, for instance, was definitely sort of a-religious. If anything, was a little inclined to Buddhism, we find. But, they were thinking much more in modern terms. After all, he was the president of the Oxford Union when he was at Oxford, as was his daughter. So they were kind of, English educated, he was almost an English gentleman. So he thought like a mid-20th century English gentleman, which was, broadly speaking, a genuflect in the direction of religion and then carry on with a thoroughly secular outlook. So Dr. Ambedkar definitely could have simply ditched the whole dreadful thing. What was it? Voltaire's famous écraser l'infâme, destroy, crush the infamous thing, religion. He could have taken that attitude because it's done so much harm, and in India was the foundation for one of the most unjust, inhuman social systems the world has ever known. Wow, no, that's wildly exaggerating. There are much worse ones, but most entrenched one, let's say, most enduring one. He could have just ditched the lot, but he knew that wouldn't work. It would only work for a while, and that what was required for the individual was a sense of a higher dimension from which human life achieves its meaning. And he found that in the Dharma. He saw the Dharma as the best religion for himself and his people because it did not teach inequality. Of course, practically, often it did. But in its essence, it did not preach inequality. It also preached non-violence. It also preached the freedom of the individual to choose. And it was, in his terms, conformable with science. In other words, it was not destroyed by reason. Even though it went beyond reason, you could reason about it. I was studying recently with the Sub-25 group, the Buddha's famous Kalama Sutta, in which he actually asks people to think clearly about the teachings. And, of course, it was also an Indian religion, so he thought that was quite important. But as a result of all this, he promulgated Buddhism. He believed that if conversion could be widespread, it would create a huge change in Indian culture and society. Unfortunately, he died 6 weeks after conversion. It was a terrible tragedy. Our own teacher happened to be in the place where he converted, Nagpur, on the day that he died, and worked tirelessly over many days to rally people because they didn't know they'd lost their great leader, and we have taken up the baton in our work in India. So I think you're probably getting a bit of a hint of where I'm going to go with secular humanism. So let me just talk about secular humanism for a little bit. Humanism, broadly speaking, I'm not talking about the humanist society or whatever, I'm not talking, as it were, about professional humanism, but humanism I understand to mean there is nothing more than human life. That's the sum total of it, and that whatever morality is to come out of that is to do with our being decent to each other. Yes, humanism is a perspective that sees life as bounded by birth and death. There's no larger life, there's no extension of life beyond death, there's no pre-existence. So its perspective on the world and of what's important in the world is therefore bounded by that. Secular, I take to mean, of course it means worldly, doesn't it? Saecula, saeculorum. It means this world It's contrasted with the heavens, as it were, in Christian theology. So the secular cuts out the whole, as it were, religious world in this larger sense that I meant. It argues that there is nothing beyond merely this existence. And in its extreme form, it argues that our consciousness is simply an epiphenomenon of matter. It's just that matter has sort of come together in a certain way, and bang, here's me looking at the world. A bit like a light bulb, there's a filament there, send a current through it, there's light. And then when the light goes out, bang. When the switch is gone, then bang, that's it. So that I take it is what we mean by secularism in a very broad and quick way, a quick and dirty way. So it's the idea that human life is all there is, and that there is no higher life, there is no life beyond this life, there is no reality beyond what we know. There's no reality, if you like, beyond scientific reality. Of course, it's not really scientific reality, it's scientistic reality, because science is these days a lot more sophisticated than that. But it's a very narrow perspective on what human life is. That is the dominant mood of our culture, particularly, say, in Britain, which is a very extreme version of what's happening in many Western cultures all over the world. I did my homework and I looked at statistics, and the majority of people in Britain no longer consider themselves Christians. A great many of those do not consider themselves to have any religion at all. Then when you interrogate those who still do consider themselves Christians, you find most of them think of themselves as Christians to the extent that when they go to hospital and they're asked their religion, they put C of E. But they don't really, Church of England, they don't really know what that means. I remember talking to my mother once and having a little argument with her about Christianity and the Church of England. I asked her if she knew the 39 Articles. Anyway, not many of you read that. But if you're a member of the Church of England, these are the principles that underlie your church. But most people don't know anything about it. And sort of when I pressed, she said, "Oh, well, I don't believe all that." And so it becomes pretty thin. It's just a sort of general sense of some sort of goodness, which is better than no sense of some sort of goodness. But it's pretty thin, and it's evaporating. It's evaporating before our eyes. It's kept alive largely by immigrants who are often very strongly Christian, but or Hindu or Muslim. But the whole population is becoming less and less religious, and that means more and more secular, more and more humanist, but not humanist in the sense of fully paid up members of the Humanist Society, who at least have a very great concern with morality. But as, in a way, morality is very vague. It's a very vague sort of sense of shouldn't do that, should do that, but largely kept in place by just the sort of inertia of history. We're still trading on a Christian cultural past. Of course, people who've come in with other religions those are still often quite alive, although they're dying among younger generations. So that's the situation we find ourselves in, and it's deadening, it's frightening. Because it means an increasingly fragmented and fractured society. There's no common ideal. There's no common sense of something higher that holds us all together. There's no common sense of a purpose beyond our mere existence. The best you get is the service of humanity, which is a jolly good thing. I applaud that. But there's nothing more than that, and all too few feel that. So it's a rather grim view of things, isn't it? It's prophet of doom. But it's, not far from the truth. So what do we do? What do we do? presumably we're here because we're at the very least interested in Buddhism, and probably quite a lot of us feel we are Buddhists, I hope. What do we do in this situation? We're not going to conduct a putsch and create a Buddhist dictatorship, I hope. Because in a sense there's no such thing. If it's a Buddhist dictatorship, it's not Buddhist. It has to be something that's voluntary. So, and we live in a democracy. So how do we work in this world which is so radically secularized, so radically humanistic, so radically scientistic? Well, what we need to do is bring the Dharma to bear in this life. We need to bring it to bear on ourselves so that we are transformed by the Dharma. And we need to bring it to bear in our operation within society. We need to bring it to bear when we go to the ballot box. We need to bring it to bear when we work. We need to bring it to bear when we're in conversation with friends. We need to bring it to bear in everything that we do, so that the Dhamma is living in us and through us affecting others. Especially, I would hope that if enough people were Buddhist, well, they would affect politicians. Politicians would be more operating on the basis of the Dhamma. They'd be serving the Dhamma. That's what one would hope, because their constituents would be. And they would look to them. We may not be able to convert the whole of Britain to Buddhism. Even I am more sanguine than that, and I'm a hopeless optimist. But we can have a jolly good go at influencing a huge number of people, so that society is looking to some higher ideal and is influenced on that basis for a moral life. Human existence meaning more than just kind of living till you die, enjoying yourself as best you can, being good to your neighbours and your friends, if possible, and your family, and that's it. Having a good funeral. The lights go out. And I think this is the problem with liberal democracy, which I love democracy. I'm a liberal in a certain sense, but my liberalism and my democratic sense are based in the Dhamma. Dr. Ambedkar famously said, he was asked what his political philosophy was, that it was liberty, equality and fraternity, which rings rather differently in European ears. But he said, I do not take these principles from the French Revolution, but from my master, the Buddha. So he founded these principles. How clearly it's not so easy to say. He founded them in the Dhamma. So he looked at democracy from the point of view of the Dhamma. He wanted to see the Dhamma Rajya, the rule of the Dhamma. That is a government, if you like, a society, an economy, that a culture that was uplifted by the Dhamma. Of course, it's a hopelessly quixotic effort, but it's an effort that we must try. We must try to influence as widely as we possibly can. We must allow Ambedkar gave in Kathmandu at the World Fellowship of Buddhists in 1956 was on Buddhism or Karl Marx. And he had obviously quite a bit of respect for Marxism in many ways, and he cooperated with communists in early labour work. But in the end, he believed that violent revolution was not the way to go forward. Interesting, he was at LSE when it was still influenced by the Fabians, Christian socialists who believed in gradual transformation through the ballot box. So he argued that violent revolution was not the way, because you simply replace one set of whatsits with another set of whatsits. I've just read a wonderful book on the Russian Revolution called A People's Tragedy by Orlando Figes. It's always good to recommend a book or two. It's a doorstopper, and it'll build your muscles, but it's a brilliant, brilliant account of the Russian Revolution, which shows exactly what Dr. Ambedkar is talking about. The way in which revolution simply changes the structure of dominance. And yes, he then said, well, the only way is voluntary, by persuading people, by bringing them into contact with the Dhamma and persuading them to live a Dhammic life. And he said, there's a recording of this, it's wonderful, because he's a very old man, he's just about to die, and he speaks with a cracked and quavering voice, and he says, people may say, he spoke rather Churchillian sort of phrasing, but I'm not going to try to imitate it. People may say that it's a tedious way, that it's a long way, it's a slow way, but one thing I will say, it is a sure way. It is the only sure way. That to bring into society moral values that depend upon a deep understanding of reality and a deep understanding of our human existence and purpose is the only way ultimately to transform society. We should take advantage of democracy with all its wonderful freedoms and use it to try to influence as widely as we can, as openly as we can, as honestly and voluntarily, as appreciatively of others as we can, so that the Dhamma comes to be a stronger and stronger factor in society. Hopefully, we'll be not alone. Hopefully, others will pursue a similar goal. I think that the Dhamma puts things far more clearly, for my taste, than any other religion, but other religions may have the same emphasis. And as long as there's no conflict in terms of people trying to grab confessional power, I don't see a problem with that. But let us strive ourselves as Buddhists to make the Dhamma live in ourselves, to make it live in society, so that people can see what our purpose is as human beings, what our purpose is together, what a human society is, what a truly human society is, and what our duties are to each other. So I'm going to talk more tomorrow night about that society and the response of the Buddhist vision of society to the rootless society that we increasingly find ourselves, certainly in Britain, and extend these principles that I've been talking about over these 2 nights into that area as well. So please do come back if you'd like to. I won't take it personally if you don't. But I hope that you've got a little glimpse, if you like, the Buddhist political project, if you see what I mean. The Buddhist political project is to bring the Dhamma into the cultural life, into the social life, even into the political life of any nation, so that people really understand what their lives are for and can live it to the best. Dr. Ambedkar famously said, the purpose of human society is to help the individual to grow and to fulfill their highest potential. So if we can promulgate that sort of idea, surely we will be making a big contribution. Maitreya Bandhu spoke very eloquently. I felt probably I should just not bother to speak after he'd spoken with his advertisement for the winter retreat. I almost felt I should go on it. But he spoke about the desperate state of the world and these appalling images that we're getting of what's happening, especially in Ukraine. That's the most prominent for us because it's so close. The worst things have happened elsewhere. But this is our answer. This is our answer. So thank you.